A young widowed mother needed a fake husband to save her land, never imagining the silent farmer was so much more. The late morning sun streamed through the windows of the red Valley Credit Union, but Harper Langley felt only the cold edge in Mason Dillard's voice. He sat across from her, flipping through her loan file like it was yesterday's newspaper. "I've kept every part of that ranch running," Harper said, keeping her chin high. "I've paid what I could. I just need a little more time." Mason leaned back, hands steepled over his belly. "Time won't change what I see, Ms. Langley. You're a single woman running a property. That's too big for you, with a debt that's growing faster than your alfalfa. I've got a harvest coming in," she replied, her voice firm. "A buyer lined up. I can catch up." "You've said that before," he said flatly, "but the numbers tell a different story. You don't have a secondary income. You don't have backing. And most importantly, you don't have a partner." Her face flushed with anger. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It has everything to do with risk. You want the bank to hold off on foreclosure. I need a guarantor. Preferably a husband, someone with financial weight, not just good intentions." She stared at him, rage rising behind her ribs. "So, I need a man to make you believe I'm worth the land my family built." Mason smirked, slow and smug. "I'm just saying it's easier to bet on someone who isn't betting alone." Harper stood without another word and walked out, her boots crunching against the gravel as she headed for her truck. Her little girl Rosie waited inside, humming to herself with a juice box in hand. Harper forced a smile and climbed in. That Saturday, Red Valley's market was humming with life. There was the sound of guitar, music, the smell of fried dough, and the scent of fresh hay in the air. Harper moved through the crowd with Rosie in tow, waving to neighbors, but keeping her worries locked tight behind her eyes. That's when she saw him. A scuffle had broken out near the fruit stand. Two teenage boys were trying to shove past an elderly vendor and grab his money box. Before anyone could react, a tall man stepped in, broad-shouldered, silent, and as calm as a windless day. He didn't yell. He didn't push. He just placed a hand on one boy's shoulder, locked eyes with the other, and waited. Within seconds, the boys turned and ran. The man handed the box back to the old vendor and nodded once before, disappearing back into the crowd. Harper watched, her heart pounding. She found him again near the tack shop, thumbing through old saddle straps. "You handle trouble quietly," she said, stepping beside him. The man looked up, his eyes clear and steady beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. "Didn't see a reason to make noise." "Harper Langley," she said, offering her hand. "Cal Bennett," he replied, shaking it briefly. Over the next few days, she kept seeing him around town, at the feed store near the post office. Rosie liked him instantly, chatting his ear off about goats and sunflower seeds and her schoolwork. He never said much, but when Rosie asked if he could braid her horse's mane, he did it without blinking. It was on the fourth day, just before sunset, when Harper sat beside him on a bench near the general store. She looked down at her hands, then at the dusty horizon. "I need help," she said finally. Cal waited, his silence an invitation to continue. "I need someone to stand next to me at the bank, just on paper. Someone Mason Dillard will respect." Husband?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not asking for money, just—" "Your name?" she clarified quickly. "Just for a few weeks until the harvest clears. Then I'll pay off what I owe and you're free to go." "You want me to pretend to be your husband?" Cal said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "I want Mason to believe this ranch has a backbone besides mine." A long pause stretched between them. Then Cal stood, dusted off his jeans, and adjusted his hat. "I'm not much for pretending," he said. Her heart sank. But then he looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering, and added, "But I reckon I know the difference between helping and walking away." And that's how it started. An agreement written in dust, sealed not by paper but by the quiet promise of a man who knew the weight of standing where others had turned their backs. Cal moved in on a Sunday afternoon with nothing more than a duffel bag, a pair of worn boots, and a toolbox that had clearly seen generations of work. He said little as Harper showed him the spare room off the kitchen. It had been her late husband Clay's old office, turned into a guest room after the funeral. The air hung thick with unspoken history, but Cal didn't pry. He just nodded once, placed his bag in the corner, and rolled up his sleeves. By Monday morning, he was already out in the fields before dawn. Harper heard the creak of the front door just after 5 a.m. When she stepped onto the porch, an hour later, coffee in hand, he was halfway through mending the broken fence along the southern pasture. He didn't talk much, but he worked like he'd been born to that land. He fixed the irrigation line without being asked and repaired a warped gate on the chicken coop. When Rosie tripped and scraped her knee trying to help muck out the stalls, Cal scooped her up without hesitation. He cleaned the cut and taught her how to patch it with gauze like a seasoned field medic. The three of them sat at the dinner table that night, and Harper was still adjusting to the sight of a man in that chair again. Cal didn't say much, just passed the potatoes and made sure Rosie had seconds of cornbread. By Wednesday, folks in town had started talking. "Looks like the Langley place finally has a man around again," said one of the ladies at the feed store, not unkindly. "Good for her. She's worked herself to the bone." "Is he your cousin or something?" asked another. "Sure is easy on them eyes for someone who doesn't say a word." Harper heard the whispers. She didn't know what to say to them, and she wasn't sure she wanted to stop them either. A strange thing had started to settle in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly hope, but a softness, a quiet comfort. She caught herself looking forward to the sound of Cal's boots on the porch, to Rosie's excited squeals when he came home with feed sacks tossed over one shoulder like it was nothing. It was Thursday night when it happened. Rosie had a meltdown before bed, crying over a ripped shoe she had outgrown. It used to be her favorite because it had tiny purple flowers on the strap. Harper held her, soothed her to sleep, and promised they'd find a way to replace them soon. An hour later, Harper walked past the kitchen and saw the back door ajar. She stepped out and saw the faint glow of a lantern from the barn. Curious, she followed it. Cal was there, sitting on a bale of hay with one of Rosie's tiny shoes in his hand. He was threading a strip of weathered leather through the side, carefully replacing the torn strap with material he had salvaged from an old saddle. His brow was furrowed with concentration, his large hands moving slow and sure. He didn't notice her watching. Or maybe he did and simply didn't acknowledge it. Harper didn't interrupt. She went back inside, poured a mug of hot cocoa, and quietly left it outside Cal's door. The next morning, Rosie found her, shoe on the windowsill mended, polished, and whole again. She squealed with delight and ran out to find Cal, who simply tipped his hat and said, "Ought to last a little longer now." Harper stood in the doorway watching them. This was a man who didn't owe them a thing, repairing what was broken, showing up when he didn't have to. The deal might have been fake, but the feeling blooming in her chest was anything but. The sun beat down on the county grain auction like a branding iron, but Harper Langley barely felt the heat. Her boots tapped nervously against the gravel as she scanned the list of buyers and sellers pinned to a clipboard. The fall harvest was everything. This year, her last card on the table. If she could get a decent price for her wheat, she might just buy herself enough time to breathe. Beside her, Cal Bennett stood with his arms crossed, watching the crowd. He wore his usual faded shirt, jeans worn soft at the knees, and that same quiet calm she was starting to recognize as a kind of armor. "You don't have to stay," Harper said, her voice low. "It's just a bunch of handshakes and hustle." Cal just gave her a glance. And Mason Dillard? She swallowed. He's here. He always shows up when there's blood in the water, as if summoned. Mason's voice cut through. The crowd a few minutes later, slick and deliberate. Well, Miss Langley, fancy seeing you here. With some muscle. Harper turned. Slowly. Mason approached, all suit and swagger, his silver bolo tie gleaming against his crisp shirt. Cal didn't move, didn't flinch, just stepped slightly in front of Harper, angling his shoulder so she was half-sheltered behind him. Looks like you're doing better. These days, Mason continued, eyeing Cal. Found yourself a partner who can string more than 2 nickels together. We're doing fine, Harper replied flatly. I'll bet. Tell me, Mr. Mason trailed off, pretending to search his memory. Bennett, Cal said, calmly. Right, Mr. Bennett. You're not from around here, are you? Just passing through, Mason smirked. Funny. I checked around. There's no record of a Cal Bennett in Wyoming. Not in business, not in banking, not even in the DMV. You sure? You're not some ghost, she made up. To keep the bank off her back, Cal met his gaze, still and steady. Ghosts don't fix fences, he said. Or feed cattle, or tuck kids in when their mamas have had a long day. Mason's smile faltered, just slightly. The auction began. Harper stepped forward when her turn came, her shoulders squared. Cal stood at her side like a stone wall. When the bidding started low, he leaned in close and whispered just 2 words, hold steady, and somehow she did. She walked away from the table with a higher price than she'd ever expected. Her wheat sold to a buyer from Cheyenne who'd never looked her way before. That night, word spread fast across Red Valley. The Langley Ranch had turned a profit in the mysterious Cal. Bennett wasn't just good with a hammer. He was good in a negotiation, too. It didn't sit well with Mason. A week later, at the town's monthly community meeting, Mason stood before the room like a preacher, about to deliver judgment. The town hall was packed. Ranchers, teachers, store owners, and retirees sat fanning themselves with county newsletters. Harper sat in the second row, Cal beside her. I'd like to bring to the board's attention, Mason began, his voice rich with mock concern, that one of our town's newest residents, a Mr. Callett Bennett, has no documentation on record, no tax file, no employment history, not even a verifiable last address. Isn't that odd? A murmur ran through the room. Harper tensed. Mason turned toward them. So I ask, who exactly is this man that Harper Langley's brought into our community, into her home? Is he even real? Cal stood slowly, and all heads turned. He looked around the room, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet calm of a man who had faced worse storms in silence. I don't have paperwork, he said plainly. I don't have a past you can find on a form. He looked toward Harper, then back at the crowd. But I'm here every morning on her land, in her barn, with her daughter at her table. I show up when the gate breaks. I haul water when the pump runs dry. And I stand beside her when folks like you want her to believe she can't do it on her own. The room went still. Cal's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I might not be in your system, Mr. Dillard, but I am here. And I ain't going anywhere. Silence hung in the air, thick as prairie dust. And in that silence, Harper realized something profound. Cal wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing with her. The first frost of autumn crept in, overnight leaving thin silver traces across the pasture grass. Cal had already been up for hours, tightening the posts on the northern fence and checking the irrigation line Harper had meant to replace months ago. He worked in silence, as always, but it was a silence that seemed to hold more than just thought. It held memories and maybe secrets. Harper stood on the porch watching him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Something had been sitting in her chest for days now. It wasn't dread exactly, but a question. A question she didn't know how or whether to ask. Cal moved like someone born to this land, But when the feed delivery had gotten mixed up earlier in the week, he'd known exactly which form to fax, which law to cite, and which department to call to get it fixed. He didn't stumble over the bureaucratic language the way most ranchers did. He handled logistics with a quiet confidence that didn't come from a small-town life. And then there was the French. 2 nights ago, Rosie had been thumbing through an old storybook that had belonged to Harper's grandmother. It had a passage in French on the title page. Rosie, curious, had asked what it meant. Before Harper could respond, Cal had translated the entire paragraph, fluently, barely glancing at the page. Now, as he shut the barn door behind him and walked toward the house, wiping his hands on a cloth, Harper felt her heart thud. He stepped onto the porch, nodding toward the sunrise. Cold's coming. Faster this year. Harper didn't answer right away. She watched him for a moment, then said quietly, You never told me where you're from. Cal paused. Does it matter? It does now, she said, her tone gentle but firm. You fixed that property line issue with the county in 15 minutes. That's a fight people around here have for months. You knew which section codes to cite. You speak fluent French. You handle livestock like you've trained them your whole life. And Rosie, she's already reading better just from your help, she swallowed. So no, I don't care if you've got a past, but I want to know who is standing beside me. Cal was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped back, leaned against the porch railing, and looked out over the fields. I used to live in a world where nothing was real, he said, his voice low and distant. Everything was image, expectations, contracts, and mergers. People wearing smiles like they were uniforms. Harper said nothing, letting him speak. I had a name people respected, a seat at tables that made decisions for people they'd never meet. And I hated every single minute of it. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from honest work. I left that life when I realized I didn't know who I was, without a title. I didn't want to be someone who made money from other people's pain. He glanced over at her, his eyes steady and clear. I came here because this is real. The dirt under your nails, the ache in your back after a harvest, the way Rosie's face lights up when you read to her. That's real. Cal took a breath. I don't know what you think I'm hiding, Harper, but I'm not here to sell you something. I'm not here to take. I'm here because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be useful without expecting applause. Harper's fingers tightened around the warm mug in her hands. You could have just said you were running, she murmured. I was, he admitted, until I realized I'd stopped, and for the first time in days, Harper didn't feel fear or suspicion. She felt a strange, quiet ache, mixture of gratitude, understanding, and something that felt dangerously close to trust. It was a quiet, windless night, the kind of silence that only comes after a long day of work and laughter. Rosie had fallen asleep on the couch after insisting she was too big for bedtime. Harper carried her gently to her room, tucking her under the quilt. Her grandmother had sewn and turned off the light. She returned to the living room and noticed the cedar chest Cal kept at. The foot of the guest bed was standing open. A trail of papers, a faded photograph, and a square of white fabric lay across the floor. Harper picked up the cloth first. It was a handkerchief made of fine linen and clearly old. At one corner, stitched in rich blue thread, were 3 words, Bennett Silver Holdings. She froze. Bennett! Her eyes darted toward the hallway. Cal wasn't back yet from fixing the generator behind the barn. Her mind raced. Bennett Silver Holdings wasn't just a name. It was the name. One of the wealthiest, most secretive mining dynasties in the West. They owned silver rights from Montana down through Arizona and had generations of money buried in vaults and stock portfolios. The name Cal Bennett had meant nothing to her until now. She gathered the papers, deeds, letters, clipped business, articles, and sat on the edge of the couch, the air in the room suddenly thin. All this time he'd been someone else, someone important, someone hiding. The front door creaked open. Harper turned sharply. Cal stepped inside, his sleeves rolled up, his hair damp with sweat. He took one look at her expression and at what was in her hands and stopped cold. "I didn't mean to." "Snoop," Harper said, her voice barely a whisper. "Rosie must have been playing in your room." I found the chest open," Cal nodded, slowly. He stepped forward, sat across from her, and for the first time, he looked tired. Not physically, but soul deep. "It was bound to come out sooner or later," he said quietly. "So it's true?" she asked. He nodded. "Bennett Silver Holdings is my family. I'm the second son. Or I was. It doesn't matter anymore." Harper stared at him, trying to reconcile. The man who fixed her fences with the heir to a fortune. "What are you doing here, Cal?" He held her gaze, running at first. "From what?" "An arranged engagement. A board seat. A life where every breath I took was bought and sold before I could even speak it. My father told me I had two options: marry a woman he approved of and take my place in the company, or lose everything. And you walked away," she whispered in awe. "I couldn't marry someone I didn't love. And I couldn't pretend to be proud of a legacy built on exploiting land and labor. So I left. No announcements, no press. I just disappeared." Harper folded the handkerchief carefully, her mind spinning. "You could have told me," she said, the words heavy with all the things she didn't say. "I wanted to. But I didn't want this ranch or you to be just another piece of something I inherited or protected. I wanted to be needed for what I could do, not for who I was born to be." A long silence fell between them, filled with the weight of his secret. Then a sharp knock rattled the front door. Cal stood, already tense. He opened it slowly. A tall man in a dark, expensive coat stood on the porch, framed by the headlights of a black SUV parked in the drive. His features were sharp, polished, his eyes hard and unnervingly familiar. "Hello, cousin," the man said with a cold smile. "Nice little disappearing act you've pulled." Cal's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here, Graham?" "I came to bring you home." "You've had your fun, Cal, but it's time to grow up. I'm not going back." "Oh, I think you are." Graham stepped forward, his tone menacing. "Because if you don't, the board will revoke your trust. Your name will be erased from the foundation. And any deal you try to make out here, land, love, or otherwise, will burn in the process." Harper stepped up to stand beside Cal. "This isn't a game." Graham barely spared her a glance. "No, ma'am. It's a business." Cal turned fully toward Graham, his eyes clear, his voice calm but cold as ice. "Tell the board whatever you want. I didn't come out here to keep their name." And as he stood there, defiantly turning his back on a fortune, Harper saw him clearly. Not the heir, not the fugitive, but just the man who had mended her fence, braided Rosie's hair, and fixed a little girl's shoe with saddle leather like it was treasure. And in that moment she knew that whatever came next, he wasn't going to run again. The days that followed Graham's visit were quieter than usual. Cal spent long hours out by the east fence line, fixing sections that weren't even broken. Harper didn't press him, but she noticed the way Rosie started, watching him differently, as if she could sense he was slipping away. One evening, as the last light faded behind the barn, Harper stood on the porch holding a small velvet box. It was the same one that had held their wedding ring, a plain silver band bought for show, for appearances for the deal. She found Cal sitting on the split-rail fence, his silhouette cut sharp against the orange horizon. "I think it's time we talk," she said gently. He turned but didn't speak. She held out the box. "It's over," she said. The act, the reason we brought you here. The deal. You've done more than I ever asked for. And now, you're free." He didn't Take the box. You don't owe me anything, Cal, Harper whispered. You can go back. Be whoever you were before this. A name on papers. A title in a tower. Cal looked away for a long moment, then back at her. I thought I was choosing between two lives, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Turns out I've only ever felt alive in one of them. Before Harper could respond, the sound of a truck kicking up gravel reached them. A white pickup rolled into the drive, a cloud of dust behind it, a wave of tension ahead. Mason Dillard stepped out, dressed in crisp denim, a folder tucked under one arm. He didn't wait for pleasantries. Ms. Langley, he called out loud, enough for Rosie, for the neighbors, for the entire world to hear. This is your final notice. The extension's expired. Either sign this or I bring in legal tomorrow. Harper stepped down from the porch slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs. I told you I'd pay, and I told you I needed security, which you don't have. Then Cal's voice cut through the yard, strong and clear. He does now. Mason turned. Cal stepped into view, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark gray vest Harper had never seen before. It was elegant, well-tailored, and clearly not meant for ranch work. It looked like it belonged to a man with a name worth something. A man like the heir to Bennett, Silver. I'm her husband, Cal said, firmly, stepping between Mason and Harper, and I'm ready to settle the debt. In full. Today, Mason blinked, stunned. What are you talking about, Cal? Reached into his pocket and handed over a bank draft. It was clean, notarized, and undeniable. This covered everything. Principal, interest, and any penalties. Mason scanned the paper, his face turning a shade darker. This is personal money from a trust, Cal nodded. It's mine to use. And this ranch is worth every cent. A hush fell over the small crowd that had started to gather. Neighbors, clerks, the mailman, even the feed store owner. All of them were staring. Harper stared too, tears already burning behind her eyes. Mason sputtered. So this whole marriage, this act, it was just a setup? Cal turned to Harper then, his eyes locked on hers. No, he said, his voice softening. It started as something we pretended. But there's not a single thing I feel for her that's fake. Harper covered her mouth with her hand, the ring box still clutched tightly in her fingers. I didn't come here to play house, Mason, Cal said, his voice steady for all to hear. I came here to learn how to build one. And I'm not leaving it behind. The entire yard, maybe the whole town, held its breath. And when Harper stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, silent, tears of joy running down her cheeks, the silence broke into applause. Neighbors clapped. Rosie ran to them, giggling through her own happy tears. Even a scowling Mason Dillard had no choice but to tip his hat and walk away. Because in that moment it didn't matter how it began. It only mattered that it was real, now. The morning after the showdown with Mason Dillard, the ranch seemed different, quieter somehow, and lighter. The debt was gone. The land was safe. And yet Harper felt like she was still waiting to exhale. She found Cal in the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up, oil on his hands as he fixed the latch to the hayloft. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. He glanced over. The latch or the loan? Harper gave a faint smile. Either. Cal set his wrench down and turned to her fully. I know. But I didn't do it because I had to. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the air warm and dusted with golden light between them. I came out here running, Harper, Cal said finally. From everything I thought I didn't want to be. From people who only saw what I could offer them, not who I was. He looked at her, his eyes steady and full of a vulnerable sincerity she'd never seen before. But I met you and Rosie in this place, and I realized maybe I wasn't running away. Maybe I was running towards something I just didn't know existed yet. She swallowed hard, her heart thudding. I didn't expect to find myself here, he said, but I did. In the work, in the quiet, in the way you look at me when you think. I'm not watching. Harper's breath caught in her throat. I love you, Cal said simply, the 3 words holding the weight of 1,000 unspoken moments. And if you'll have me, not for the bank, not for the ranch, not to play husband, but really have me, I want to marry you. For real. For a long moment she didn't speak. She just stepped closer and rested, her forehead against his chest, breathing in the scent of hay, oil, and home. Yes, she whispered into his shirt. Yes, they told Rosie, that night over dinner. The little girl squealed so loudly she knocked her glass of milk over, then immediately asked if she could wear a flower crown to the ceremony. The following week, while Harper was away visiting a feed supplier, in town Cal disappeared for a full day. When she returned, she found a small new wooden building nestled near the old oak tree where her mother used to read books aloud on summer nights. It was a one-room structure with wide windows and white trim. A simple hand-carved sign hung above the door, Clara's library. She opened the door with shaking hands and stepped into a world of memory. Rows of books lined handmade shelves. A rocking chair sat in the corner, next to a small reading lamp. Framed photos of her mother as a young girl reading in the grass hung beside prints of old cowboy, poetry and art. Cal stood by the window looking, nervous for the first time in weeks. I tracked down every title she ever talked about in your journals, he said, his voice soft. Found some in auctions, some in used shops. I built the shelves myself. Harper couldn't speak. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes filled with tears. She talked about opening a little place like this, Harper finally whispered. Said it would be free for the kids in the valley who didn't have books. At home, Cal nodded. It's open, always. Rosie already calls it her Starbucks fort. She walked toward him and took his hand, her touch, conveying everything her words could not. Do you have any idea what this means to me? Cal met her gaze, his own eyes shining. I don't, but I know what you mean to me. And in that tiny library, wrapped in the warmth of wood and words and love, Harper Langley kissed Cal Bennett for the first time. Not out of obligation or desperation or pretense, but because it was real. Because with him nothing was pretend. It never had been. The morning sun rose golden over Red Valley, casting a soft, forgiving light across the fields that had weathered storms, debt, and doubt. At the edge of the Langley Ranch, where the tall grass waved like a sea of gold, a wedding was about to take place. Rows of mismatched wooden chairs had been set up between hay bales and flower barrels. Wildflowers were tucked into mason jars along every row, and at the end of the aisle stood an arch made from driftwood and old barbed wire, weathered, imperfect, and beautiful, just like them. It wasn't a grand wedding. It was better. There was no tuxedo, no string, quartet, but the entire town came, dressed in their Sunday best or their clean barn boots, each carrying a covered dish and a story to share. Betty from the feed store brought her famous peach cobbler and a photo of Harper's mother from their old quilting circle. Carl, the widower from 2 ranches over, offered to sing a gospel hymn that made everyone cry. Even Mason Dillard showed up, grudgingly, with a bottle of good bourbon and an awkward toast that made everyone laugh. Harper wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple lace gown, yellowed slightly at the seams but radiant on her. She had spent the morning with Rosie, brushing her hair, pinning wildflowers behind her ears, and trying not to cry before the ceremony even began. Cal stood at the front, waiting beneath the arch. He wore dark denim, a freshly pressed shirt, and his old, weathered cowboy hat, the same one he'd worn the day he first fixed her fence. The only new thing he wore was a small silver pin at his collar, etched with the shape of a hawk in flight, a quiet tribute to Harper's mother's favorite bird. When the music started, a single fiddle, played by a girl from town, Rosie marched proudly down the aisle scattering dried rose petals from a bucket. Her boots were a little too big, and her grin was even bigger. The crowd chuckled and wiped their eyes in equal measure. Then Harper came, and the whole world seemed to pause. She walked with no veil, no heels, no pretense, just heart, just hope, just the woman Cal had fallen for, before he even realized it. As she reached the front, Cal took her hand. "You look like home," he whispered. She smiled, her eyes shining. "You always did." The vows were short, but no one there would ever forget them. "I thought I knew what wealth was," Cal said, his voice strong and clear. "But it wasn't silver. It was the way your daughter hugged my leg the first time I fixed her shoe. It was the sound of your laugh when you thought I wasn't listening. It was watching you fight like hell to keep this land and this love, without ever asking anyone to say, you say." Harper's eyes filled with tears as it was her turn to speak. "And now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm not fighting alone." When they kissed, the whole town stood and cheered. Rosie squealed and clapped so hard, her flower crown fell off. Cal picked her up with one arm and spun her once around before planting her between them in the biggest group hug the ranch had ever seen. As the sun dipped lower, the celebration truly began. Kids chased each other through the wheat stubble. Old friends danced to fiddle tunes under strings of twinkling lights. The food ran out twice, but the stories didn't stop. And when dusk settled over Red Valley like a soft wool blanket, Rosie ran barefoot through the tall grass, holding a little homemade flag stitched with the initials H and C. Her laughter echoed like wind chimes in the quiet air. Harper and Cal stood at the edge of the field, hand in hand, watching her dance with the twilight. "I used to think I was rich because of the silver," Cal said quietly, his eyes on Rosie's silhouette against the golden light. "But I know better now." Harper turned toward him, her smile soft and full of love. "I'm rich," he continued, his voice filled with a profound sense of peace, "because one day you let a stranger in the door. Because you handed me a mug of hot tea and didn't ask where I'd been. Because you saw who I really was, under all the dirt and under the past, and you stayed." She rested, her head on his shoulder. "I didn't just stay," she whispered. "I chose you again and again." Cal kissed the top of her head. Behind them, the little library stood glowing. The garden was full, and the ranch was, and always would, be theirs. And before them, the field stretched wide, the sky even wider. Real land, real love, real forever. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through the golden fields of Red Valley. If Cal and Harper's story of love, courage, and second chances touched your soul, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories for more emotional, powerful, and deeply human tales. We share stories that heal, stories that inspire, and stories that remind us of the quiet strengths within us all. Until next time, may your days be filled with kindness, and may you always find love, sometimes in the places you least expect it. Like, comment, and share to help others discover stories that truly matter.